everything about aperture in photography. Welcome to this lesson in my Learn Photography for Free series. The question has been asked, what is aperture and how do I use it in my photography? Aperture can be very confusing for new photographers because it controls so many aspects of taking a photo. While some of its functions are technical, it can also greatly impact the appearance of a photo. People learning photography might get confused because they're only taught the basics of aperture. But don't worry, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know to get you started. Aperture is a setting in a camera that controls the size of the aperture opening in the lens. It is measured in f-stops and it can be adjusted to allow more or less light into the camera. The aperture opening is created by a set of overlapping metal blades that form a circular hole. The aperture setting is adjusted by changing the size of this hole. When the aperture is set to a large size, which is a smaller f-stop number, more light is allowed to pass through the lens and reach the sensor, resulting in a brighter image. When the aperture is set to a smaller size, which is a larger f-stop number, less light will be allowed to pass through that hole through the lens, resulting in a darker image. But that is not all aperture does. In addition to controlling the amount of light in a photograph, aperture also affects the depth of field. Depth of field is the range of distance in an image that is in focus. A larger aperture, smaller f-stop number, will result in a shallow depth of field, while a smaller aperture, smaller hole, or smaller f-stop number will result in a deeper depth of field. So by adjusting the aperture setting, you can control both the amount of light in an image and the range of sharpness or focus in the photograph. But let's break this down. Aperture plays a key role in controlling the exposure in a photograph. Exposure refers to the amount of light that is captured by the camera sensor when a photograph is taken. If a photograph is overexposed, it will appear too bright and washed out. If a photograph is underexposed, it will appear too dark and may lack detail. Aperture is just one of three main factors that control exposure, along with shutter speed and ISO. By adjusting the aperture setting, you can control the amount of light that enters the camera through the camera lens and reaches the sensor. A larger aperture, with smaller f-stop number, allows more light to pass through the lens, resulting in a brighter image. While a smaller aperture, which is a large f-stop number, allows less light to pass through the lens, resulting in a darker image. By adjusting the aperture, that whole size, you can achieve the proper exposure for any given scene. If the scene is too dark, you can adjust to a larger aperture, which is a small f-stop number, to allow more light into the camera until your scene is well exposed. If the scene is very bright, like outside on a sunny day, you can adjust to a smaller aperture, which is a large f-stop number, to block some of the light from entering the camera lens until your scene is well exposed. By balancing aperture, shutter speed and ISO settings, you can achieve the desired exposure for your photograph. Aperture scale is a way of measuring the size of the aperture opening through which light passes in the lens. It is expressed in f-stops, which are a standardized series of numbers that represent the size of the aperture. The f-stop scale is an inverse relationship, meaning a smaller f-stop number represents a larger aperture opening, while a larger f-stop number represents a smaller aperture opening. The f-stop scale is important because it allows photographers to fine-tune the amount of light entering the camera. It is also a way of explaining to other people what your f-stop number was so that they understand what your setting was for the particular photo that you did. By adjusting the aperture to different f-stop values, photographers can control the exposure of their images and achieve their desired brightness or darkness to their liking. The significance of f-stops lies in the fact that each increment in the f-stop scale represents a doubling or halving of the amount of light entering the lens. Going from f4 to f5.6 halves the amount of light entering the camera, while going from f4 to f2.8 doubles the amount of light. This allows photographers to make precise adjustments to their exposure. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO are the three main factors that control the overall exposure of a photograph, and these are often referred to as the exposure triangle. Aperture refers to the size of the opening of the lens through which the light passes, as we've mentioned. Controlling this size obviously allows you to decide how much light reaches the camera sensor. And then also, aperture affects the depth of field in a photograph, while shutter speed refers to the amount of time that the camera's sensor is exposed to that light coming in through the aperture. A faster shutter speed allows less light to reach the sensor, while a slower shutter speed allows more light to reach the sensor because it has more time. Shutter speed can also be used to freeze or blur motion in a photograph. ISO is a measure of the camera sensitivity to light. A higher ISO value allows the camera to boost the sensitivity of the sensor, while a lower ISO value makes the camera less sensitive to light. These three factors are all related and work together to control the overall exposure of a photograph. By adjusting one or more of these settings, you can achieve any desired brightness or darkness in your image. For example, if you want to take a photo in a low light situation, like a club or inside a house with low light, you might open the aperture by using a smaller f-stop number to allow more light to enter the lens. You'll also use a slightly slower shutter speed so the light reaches the sensor for a longer period of time. You can also increase the ISO, making the sensor more sensitive to light. On the other hand, if you want to take a photo in a very bright situation, like outside at a pool on a sunny day, you might close the aperture using a larger f-stop number, which reduces the amount of light entering the lens. And you will use a faster shutter speed so the light reaches the sensor for a shorter amount of time. And you will decrease the ISO number to reduce the light sensitivity of the sensor. By understanding the relationship between these three settings, you can effectively control exposure of any photo. But lenses are not created equal. Not all lenses have a maximum aperture of 2.8, especially kit lenses and some entry level lenses. tend to have maximum apertures of f3.5 at the wide end and only f5.6 when zoomed in. The aperture will also change when you zoom in. Lenses with a large aperture, like 2.8, are usually more expensive, especially those with a constant aperture through its zoom range, from wide to zoomed in. Lenses with a large aperture are called fast lenses. Why are they called fast lenses? Lenses with a large aperture, like 2.8, f2.8, 1.8, or even 1.2 are called fast lenses because they allow more light to enter the camera at those large aperture settings, which means you can use a faster shutter speed to achieve proper exposure. Professional photographers often choose these fast lenses for low light photography, where they may want to shoot handheld without sacrificing quality issues by introducing blur due to being forced to use a slow shutter. Depth of field is the range of distance in a photograph that appears to be in focus, as I've mentioned. When an image has a shallow depth of field, only a small portion of the image will be in focus at that selected focus point, while the rest at the front and back will be blurred. When an image has a deep depth of field, a larger portion of the image is in focus from that selected focus point. Aperture plays a major role in determining the depth of field of a photograph. A larger aperture with a small f-stop number not only allows more light to pass through the lens, but also results in that shallower depth of field. A smaller aperture with a larger f-stop number will allow less light to pass through the lens and will result in a deeper depth of field. For example, if you want to take a portrait of a person with a blurred background, you might want to use a larger aperture, small f-stop number, to create a shallow depth of field. On the other hand, if you want to take a landscape photo with everything in focus, you might want to use a smaller aperture, large f-stop number, to create a deep depth of field. You need to consider the subject of your photograph and the desired depth of field. Here are some examples of how you might choose the right aperture for different creative effects. If you want to create a blurred background effect in a portrait or other type of photography, you need to select the largest aperture or a larger aperture to create a shallow depth of field. An example, you use f2.8 to create a blurry background. The closer your subject or person or object is to your lens, the more the background will blur. Wide-angle lenses will blur less than zoom lenses, which is why portrait photographers prefer lenses with a focal length of 50 millimeters or even 85 millimeters or more. If you want to keep everything in focus, such as in landscape photography or architecture photos, you need to select a smaller aperture to create a deep depth of field. For example, you might use an aperture of f8 or f11, or a little higher if your lens is good quality, to keep the entire scene in focus. Also keep in mind that the focus points should be far from your camera, or else you will still experience some blur due to focal length difference. Wide-angle lenses of less than 50 millimeter will often give a deeper depth of field than those with a longer focal length, like 85 millimeter or more. If you want to create a creative blur effect, such as a blurred motion trail, You can use a larger aperture, which is a small f-stop number, and slower shutter speed on purpose to allow light to enter the camera for a longer period, which creates blur or a longer exposure. This technique, while you are following the subject, is called dragging the shutter and can create great effects by purposefully allowing blur to occur in specific areas of your image. Aperture can affect the lens sharpness and other optical characteristics. When it comes to lens sharpness, aperture can have both positive and negative effects. At small apertures, which is a large f-stop number, such as f8 or f11, a lens is typically at its sharpest. This is because the aperture blades are almost closed, which reduces the amount of light entering the lens and limits the effects of lens aberrations. However, at very small apertures, which is very large f-stop numbers such as f16 or f22, some lens sharpness can start to degrade due to a phenomenon called diffraction. Diffraction occurs when light waves start to bend as they pass through a very small aperture, which can cause the image to become softer and less defined at edges. It is in very expensive, high-quality lenses, this is minimized by special coatings and special lens elements. But in cheaper lenses, this may present image quality problems. On the other hand, at large apertures, which is a small f-stop number, such as 2.8 or smaller numbers, f1.8, etc., lens sharpness can also be reduced due to lens aberrations. Lens aberrations are distortions that occur when the light passes through the lens, and they can cause the image to appear a little softer or distorted. Higher quality lenses obviously are less prone to this problem, but they also become very expensive. In addition to sharpness, aperture can also affect other optical characteristics of a photograph, such as bokeh, the aesthetic quality of the blur in the out of focus areas of an image, and even vignetting, which is those darkening of the corners of an image. To choose the right aperture for optimal lens performance, it's important to consider the desired depth of field first, and the desired level of sharpness in the image. In general, smaller apertures, which are large f-stop numbers, in the medium range, like f8 to f11, are best for maximizing sharpness and minimizing lens aberrations and diffraction, while very large apertures, it's a small f-stop number, are best for creating a shallow depth of field and pleasing bokeh. It is best to experiment with your lenses at various f-stops to learn the characteristics of the various aperture values. You can use the A mode, also called the AV mode on some cameras, and then start setting various values while shooting the same subject over and over and making notes. The aperture setting can have a big impact on the sharpness and other optical characteristics of a photograph, depending on the quality of your lens. By understanding how aperture affects the optical characteristics of a photograph, you can choose the right aperture setting to achieve the desired look and feel in your images. But you need to learn the characteristics of each of your lenses. Stopping down refers to the process of using a smaller aperture, which is a large f-stop number, in order to increase the depth of field in a photograph. Stopping down can be useful for situations where you want a larger portion of your image to be in focus and sharp, such as landscape and architecture and outside photography. However, stopping down has the negative effect on some lenses of reducing sharpness and the overall quality of the photograph due to diffraction. Diffraction occurs when the light waves start bending around the aperture blades when they pass through a very small opening, as previously mentioned. And this causes the image to become softer due to that wavy diffraction. Diffraction can also cause odd colors at the edges of images, and the effects of diffraction become more noticeable as the aperture is stopped down to very small sizes. Large f-stop numbers like f16 or even f22 or more if the lens supports it. At these apertures, the image can start to appear blurry even and lacking in detail, even if the depth of field is increased. Higher quality lenses may not have this problem at all or show very little diffraction. When it comes to stopping down and diffraction, there is a trade-off between increasing the depth of field and maintaining sharpness, depending on your lens, your lens's ability and its quality. In general, it's best to avoid using very small apertures unless your lens still produces good quality at those very small apertures, unless it is necessary for the desired depth of field. Instead, you can try using a small aperture that is still large enough to minimize the effects of diffraction, such as f8 or f11, and focus at a far point. It is also worth noting that the effects of diffraction can vary depending on a number of factors, like lens quality being used, as well as the sensor size and resolution of the camera. Some lenses and cameras are more resistant to diffraction than others, like full-frame cameras are way more resistant to diffraction. But often they cost more, so it's always a good idea to test out different aperture sizes and settings on your camera, and test all your lenses to see how each affects the sharpness and overall optical quality of your photographs. Using aperture to control exposure in low light situations. It is important to understand that not all lenses are able to achieve a very wide aperture setting such as 2.8 or larger. If you are using a kit lens, which is normally supplied with your camera for low light photography, it may only be able to go as wide as 3.5 or 5.6 when it is zoomed in. In low light situations, you should use aperture priority or even manual mode and set the aperture to the widest setting like f3.5. Don't zoom in, because this will make the aperture even smaller and let in less light on a kit lens. Some cheaper lenses may not have constant aperture and will suffer the same problem as kit lenses, where as soon as you zoom in, the aperture closes down. If you can get a quality lens with a constant f2.8 aperture, it will take better low light photos. A f2.8 aperture is good for low light photography because it lets in twice as much light as f5.6. This means you can take fairly good photos in dimmer light environments. However, using an f2.8 aperture will give you a shallow depth of field, which means only a small part of your photo will be in focus at the focus point. The depth of field at f2.8 will become even more pronounced. It will become a shallow depth of field the closer your subject is to your lens. This might not matter if you are taking a wide angle shot and the subject and focus point is further from you. Wider apertures like f1.8 or 1.4 can be helpful for low light photography, but they are not always necessary, and they do introduce an even shallower depth of field at those wide apertures, which makes it harder to select an appropriate focus point, especially when you need more of a scene to be in focus, like a group of people. F2.8 is a good place to start, and it will allow you to take good low light photos. In some situations like night sports photography, using a flash may not always be allowed or may not be practical. That's where having fast lenses becomes important. A fast lens like one with a wide aperture like 2.8 or even f1.8 can let in more light, which allows you to use a faster shutter speed and a lower ISO setting, resulting in higher quality images. On the other hand, if you have a zoom lens that only allows you to use a narrower aperture like 5.6, you may have to use a higher ISO setting, which can lead to more noise being introduced into your images, which reduces the quality. In high-speed photography, day or night, you need to find a combination of settings which are appropriate for the exposure of the images you wish to capture. If you wish to stop all motion, then begin by selecting a shutter speed that will stop the motion. Open up the aperture and lift the ISO if needed until you have the desired look and all motion is still stopped. If you are in a low light situation, you have to make a trade-off, as raising the ISO value will introduce noise. Sometimes the noise will be acceptable, but this is where you need to decide what is acceptable. I shoot oval track racing, and the race cars come by very fast. And in some photos, blur is not always bad, as it does show the motion. So I actually purposefully use slower shutter speed, and then I follow the subject carefully to keep them in focus and as sharp as possible. This is called dragging the shutter and creates a photo effect which shows the speed and motion while maintaining a pleasing look and keeps the car fairly in focus, depending on practice. Bokeh. The term bokeh is derived from the Japanese word bokeh, without an H. English added the H, which means blur or haze. The way a lens renders out of focus points of light is an important aspect of bokeh. The shape and quality of the bokeh can be influenced by the lens's aberrations, internal, and the aperture shape. Lens aberrations refer to the slight imperfections in a lens that can cause light to be distorted or not focused properly. Some lenses can produce smoother, more pleasing bokeh with less visible aberrations, while others may produce bokeh that appears to have more defined edges or disc-like shapes. Aperture shape depends on the number of aperture blades and their curve, and this will affect the look of the bokeh, as a round aperture will produce a circular bokeh, while a polygonal aperture may produce hexagonal or octagonal bokeh depending on the number of blades. All this gives a photograph a very specific aesthetic look and is one of the creative aspects that photographers take advantage of and makes some lenses more appealing than others depending on the look that the photographer is after. Selective focus is a photographic technique in which the camera is focused on a subject while the rest of the image is out of focus, bringing attention to the subject. This is achieved by controlling the depth of field and understanding the depth of field. This can be controlled by aperture, focal length, and distance to subject. But in this lesson, I will only explain aperture, as focal length is a subject all on its own. To achieve a shallow depth of field and selective focus, a large aperture, like F number like 1.8, 1.2 is typically used. This technique is often used in portraits to focus on the subject's eyes, usually the eye that's closest to the camera if the head is slightly turned. In other types of photography, it is used to highlight an important part of the image where it may be an object or person. It is used to separate the subject from the background and draw attention to the subject and create a sense of depth. There is so much more I can tell you about using aperture, such as how large aperture affects macro photography and how depth of field can be deepened with focus stacking. I could also tell you how aperture affects astrophotography, where you want maybe a faster shutter speed to reduce the movement of the stars, or even purposefully making star trails using long exposures. But this will make this lesson just way too long. So I hope that the information I have provided helps you understand aperture and how you can use it in your photography. If you have questions, leave them down in the comment section, and I will try to answer where it is possible. Please do subscribe and hit that notification bell so you know when the next video is up, and I will see you in the next video.